Stop! Right there. Are you one of those car owners that are making one of the most critical mistakes to your car's engine that will drastically reduce its lifespan? Yes, it could be related to oil, fuel, coolant, check engine lights, and a host of other issues and mistakes that people are making currently that will drastically reduce the lifespan. I'm going to share a list of 5 of those critical mistakes and how you can avoid them so you can make your car last almost forever. Let's get into it now. Life's too short to drive boring cars. The first mistake that a lot of car owners are doing to their cars is related to one of the lifebloods of this particular vehicles. Right there is your coolant reservoir. As you'll notice, there's a quick reference to your owner's manual. There's also a reference on how to check your fluid, and every vehicle has its own methods. This particular car actually has a test procedure. A lot of other vehicles actually have just a clear reservoir so you can see the level from the outside. The key to this component is using the right blend of coolant. Some people find themselves running a little low. The level on the reservoir is a little low, so they go out to their nearest Canadian Tire or Pep Boys, grab a jug of generic antifreeze, and then they put a mixture of different colors. For example, yellow or green and clear. There are often mistakes made by that can cause extra corrosion within the system, and a lot of those coolants are specifically designed for that type of engine, so it maximizes efficiency and reduces the amount of scaling and issues or breakdown or even leaks that your car might see. As you can see, these are all different colored antifreezes. What you don't want to use is a BMW in a Mercedes type car. The other issue you have to ask yourself is, why is the coolant level low? Cars aren't designed to consume that. It's either leaked or it's burned somewhere. If it's burned, in other words, if you're using it through inside the engine, that usually means you've got coolant making its way into the combustion chamber, and that's usually a result of mixing or possibly a burnt head gasket. If you've got a bad head gasket, you might also see white smoke coming out of the exhaust tips down here. That could be a point or a classic symptom that you've got a coolant burning situation right here and that you might have a head gasket that's blown. So keep an eye, of course, for white smoke coming out of your vehicle. That looks much more dense than normal exhaust that you normally see from most other vehicles. That might be a sign that you actually have a problem there. It also shouldn't be leaking it, and that's one of the classic issues that a lot of owners tend to neglect. At the end of the day, if you're using coolant and you let the level drop too low, remember, that's very fluid that keeps the vehicles cool, running optimally, and prevents it from overheating. It also is used in a lot of these modern day vehicles to cool the turbocharger. So the wrong grade of coolant and potentially low fluid levels there, you can take a toll on the engine and the turbocharger as a whole. Now, while a lot of great cars like Toyotas and Hondas still use a good old classic rubber hose with a really all-tension spring clamp that holds really well, they rarely leak. There are other options. Radiator, water pumps can leak. But when you're dealing with vehicles like a lot of the modern-day luxury brands, we're looking at Mercedes here, often use other types of hoses. For example, they use hoses like this that are problematic. They actually have keyed fittings like that. They're plastic on the sides, and with a lot of heating and cooling cycles, these can actually split and start to leak. And they're very, very expensive, so I understand why a lot of people often skip the maintenance. You might see a little dribble of coolant down the side of this hose, and a lot of people say, you know what, good enough, I'll keep topping up the antifreeze. But that's not good enough. Neglecting your coolant can literally cause you a serious problem in the long run. So at the end of the day, if you're not burning and you're not seeing the white smoke, then you're probably leaking it if you're having to add some coolant. So you gotta have to check out some of the critical areas. Number one, take a look underneath the car. If you're not seeing any obvious puddles down there, particularly if the road is dry and you don't see coolant down there, sometimes it's a very light leak. But start checking hoses. Like right here, you have those hose clamps right there. That's those plastic hose fittings. You may have an issue with the reservoir. Sometimes these separations here can cause them to dribble or leak out of there. Maybe the radiator is sometimes problematic. On the ends of the radiator, as you can see, the rad sits across the front, and it could be one of the ends is leaking. Also, you could have a water pump problem. Water pumps are what's pushed the fluid through the system, and of course it can leak from the water pump, as the water pump literally in this case is a mechanical unit that actually has a pulley from the outside, and there's a shaft that runs into the pump, into the impellers, and of course that seal is a place that it can leak, as well as the gasket that holds it to the engine. So the key is, if you're leaking, fix whatever the problem is, don't neglect it, don't wait, get on it right away. The second big mistake that a lot of owners make on their vehicles, remember, today's day and age, a lot of vehicles are turbocharged, they're running hotter, stronger, smaller displacement means they're more stressed. But how do they mitigate those stresses, and how do they create more power? Well, they actually create engines with turbocharging and higher static compression ratios. That basically means they require a better grade of fuel. And you'll notice the fuel cap. Of course, often you'll either have a marking somewhere on the door, or in this case, you'll look right there and it says minimum octane rating 91 right there. A lot of these modern day engines require a much higher grade of fuel to prevent detonation. That's that knocking and pinging you might hear when you floor the throttle and you hear a little in the background, that clunk, 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 knock, 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 because there's too much pre-ignition going on and not enough octane rating in your fuel. These Mercedes-Benz, the C300 that we're looking at here, has an inherent issue that you're starting to hear about in some of the forums. And it's this 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine that now is having some problems with piston number 1 cracking and actually these engines blowing up. Why is that? Well, firstly, that's not unique to Mercedes, but secondly, a lot of it has to do with the fact that people are starting to use a lower or mid-grade of fuel, and it's chalked up to actually not enough octane in the fuel, and now some owners are finding themselves with engines that are blowing up with time. It may not happen on the first fuel ad, may not happen on the second fuel ad, but it may happen eventually. The EGR system may be another problem, but basically at the end of the day, the proper fueling is the way to go. And then you grab what we have here is the owner's manual. We're talking about a Mercedes-Benz, and I found it in the glove box. Most vehicles will have them. So you want to refer to the owner's manual. And for example, when we talk about the fuel, it literally tells you right in here the things to use and the things not to use. For example, it literally says use 91 octane, and then when you look down below, it says do not use the following: gasoline with more than 10% ethanol, E100 or 100% ethanol, gasoline with methanol, M100, 100% methanol. Basically don't want to use additives or even diesel. Obviously, this is a gas-powered vehicle. So you want to use the right fuel for the right vehicle. And if you don't follow the owner's manual and there's a way for them to figure that out or track it down, often your warranty could even be void. But the worst case is you just end up destroying your engine. Try within all your power to avoid the use of alcohol fuels. Those are hard on engines. They burn seals, they cause leaks, and again, they cause internal engine damage with a period of time. The third mistake that a lot of owners make of their cars: I'll get into somebody's car, I'll sit in the passenger seat, I'll look over at the dashboard, and I'll see that glowing amber light. In the center of the dash there, you'll find a check engine light. And the check engine light usually means something has gone awry, something's not functioning as it should. The check engine light doesn't always mean directly that the engine is a problem. It could be one of the many hundreds of sensors that you find within the skins of a lot of modern day vehicles. For example, all vehicles pretty much to control emissions have O2 sensors. Often you have oxygen sensors before and after catalytic converters. You have oxygen sensors sometimes right off the exhaust manifold. You have mass airflow sensors in some engines that actually regulate how much fuel goes into that engine based on what it's reading. There's NOx sensors. There's also sometimes check engine lights for misfires. Maybe you have a bad ignition coil or a spark plug. Sometimes even transmission faults or a whole plethora of other issues wind up into the computer of the car and result in a check engine light. Well, a standard do-it-yourselfer can't necessarily look at that and say, hey, my car's running smooth, there's no issue. That's not true. Often a check engine light can just illuminate and you think all is good. The car's still running fine, it starts well. Often there's something buried underneath. Do never neglect check engine lights because it's usually a sign of something going wrong. Often your vehicle can compensate for some problems by overfueling, underfueling, which could then indirectly cause detonation. This directly or chronically can cause problems with your engine. Remember, a lot of these engines nowadays can cost anywhere from $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 for a full replacement. So if you think you can't afford to replace an oxygen sensor or some other sensor, you can't afford the diagnostic fee at the dealership, well, think again, because you probably can't afford a whole new engine for one of these modern day, very expensive drivetrains. So if you have a check engine light, don't ignore it. The fourth big mistake is what a lot of owners do, and it's really all about neglect or abuse and how you treat the car when it's cold, when it's hot, and how you actually drive it. For example, a lot of people just go and start their car and they let it idle for 30 minutes, sometimes in really cold weather. Well, that takes a toll, that burns off valve guides, and you'll have oil consumption way before you know it. But more importantly, what a lot of owners do is they'll start their car and they'll gun it. They'll drive it hard right away. The car's not even nearly warmed up and they're already accelerating hard onto the freeway or gunning it away, heading off to work because they're in a rush, so they just floor it. That is drastically bad for the engine. The idea, what you want to do is start the car, let it run and idle for 30 30 seconds to a minute. If it's very, very cold out, as in minus 30-degree temperature, sure, maybe a minute or two, but then you want to set off nice and easy. Let the vehicle creep down the road, go quarter throttle, just enough to move down, give the vehicle a chance to properly warm up. A lot of people don't do that. Not doing that will definitely take a toll. You can literally break piston rings and wear out bearings and lower end of your engine because it's not properly lubricated. Have you ever seen heavy, thick oil in minus 10-degree weather? It doesn't flow very well, and that can literally prevent your engine from properly lubricating itself. The other problem is people drive cars like this hard, and then they pull up on the driveway after a trip on the freeway and turn it off right away. Do you know that most vehicles today are turbocharged? You almost cannot find a vehicle that's not turbocharged these days. Turbos continually spin hot once you turn the vehicle off, but it starts to slow down, and then the oil that's used to lubricate the bearings on a turbo often start to coke up, and that can fry the turbo. Bad turbo can end up costing you $3,000 to replace. So ideally what you want to do is pull up after a hard drive, let the vehicle idle for 30 seconds, ideally a minute on the driveway, then turn that vehicle off. So the oil lubricates everything, the turbos will last a lot longer, and that will save you drastic amounts of money. A lot of these vehicles, often with turbochargers, superchargers, or vehicles that have aggressive timing, high performance engines, and people lug the engine. In other words, very low RPM, and they're flooring it from a very low RPM. You either shift, get your RPMs up and move the vehicle along with higher revs, or lighten up on the throttle. But basically at very low revs, flooring it will lug the engine, or keeping the revs too low can lug the engine, and that will definitely take a wear and tear on drivetrain, timing chain hardware, and of course it can potentially knock and detonate the engine, and you can result in drastically reduced lifespan on that engine. Don't lug it. Get the revs up. Ideally, you're driving along the road doing 25, 3,500 RPM. That's your sweet spot for most engines these days. That way, when you need to pass, you get on the throttle, zing, away you go, and you're not lugging the engine. So the fifth mistake that a lot of owners do to their cars is what's literally listed in your owner's manual. You can always refer to the owner's manual for all the information you need specifically to manage the oil issues that your vehicle requires. For example, how much oil does it need? How frequent does it need to be changed? How do you check it? All those details can be found in this great little owner's manual. For example, when you flip up the hood, you'll often find a couple of details. A lot of the filler caps for the oil right there always make a reference to the owner's manual, as you see right there. That basically tells you everything you need to know. You can see in yellow, there's your dipstick for checking the oil, and you can look into your owner's manual right here as we see Mercedes-Benz approved. And if you scroll on down, you'll notice that Mercedes-Benz recommends a 040 or a 540 weight oil, and that's generally synthetic. The first number, the 0, is basically the low level, the cold rating of the oil. The higher number is the 40 weight. Of course, that's the top temperature when a vehicle's hot and running. So obviously the higher rating of the top number means you're going to be better protected for higher, more aggressive driving conditions, hotter temperatures, ambient, maybe in the desert. Whereas the low number, the 0, would be the number that reflects when you're driving in cold weather. You want cold starts that are better and more productive. If you're living in places like this where you've got snow all the time and it's frozen Arctic, you want a lower number, like a 040. Synthetic is a perfect oil, perfect blend for these types of environments. So regardless, you never want to veer off what Mercedes or any other manufacturer suggests of the type and weight of oil that you need. Now, you can choose to use Mobil 1 or Shell or a lot of different products. There's a lot of great oils out there, but it's the weight of that oil that is the biggest factor in determining what you need to do to keep this vehicle running well. The other part with the oil, it's imperative that you change the oil at a regular frequency. Back before synthetic oils, oil changes had to be done typically at 3,000 miles, and then oil was often breaking down or start to develop too much contaminants. Nowadays, with modern synthetic oils, they do a great job of keeping the oil cleaner and maintain its protection values. Obviously, now you can escalate those levels. Always refer to the owner's manual, but generally rule of thumb of about 5,000 miles for synthetic oil, up to maybe 8,000 miles at the very highest end of the scale. I never go to the 10,000, 12,000 that a lot of manufacturers do recommend. I truly believe a lot of those numbers are literally based on those free services that they offer up. You know, a lot of these manufacturers now sell these 3 and 5 year maintenance packages. And of course, when they do that, they don't want to be doing an oil change every 6 months for you. That costs them lots of money. So they find a happy medium to get that vehicle through warranty, do just enough oil changes just as a bare minimum. Personally, I don't believe that's enough. I stick with the 5,000 to 8,000 mile oil service intervals, still use the right grade of oil, but then that certainly is going to put you in a much better place to keep your engine lasting a long, long time. But there's another really, really important factor in what not to ignore when you're dealing with your oil, because ultimately oil is the lifeblood of these engines, and that's what keeps these vehicles running well, smooth, lubricated, and cool. One of those factors is checking the oil level, because if your oil level is too high, as for example, you might have just recently done an oil change and you added too much, don't run that engine. Drain the appropriate amount. So you definitely want to not have too much oil, but you don't want to have too little oil either. So it's imperative that you constantly check the level of your oil to know whether you have to top it up or whether you don't. And how do you do that? Refer to the owner's manual is always one great default, but you can also check the dipstick. Basically, give this a pull on level ground, pull this out, you give it a wipe, and then you can look right on there and you'll see the oil should be between the two marks. So old engines like this, big V8s that don't run hard, they have a low compression ratio, you can put sloppy oil in there and they'll run for a long time. The problem is modern day engines like you find in modern day cars like we're looking at right here in a Mercedes-Benz. Obviously, a lot of these vehicles nowadays are much more high performance. What we're dealing with is a small engine that still produces more power than that big V8. And that's all done with 2 liters and turbocharging. And because of that, that oil is stressed and strained a lot more than most other cars would be. This car is asked to perform a lot better, get a lot better fuel economy, and put out the power. The turbos create heat, that breaks down oil. The bottom end, the top end are always working harder. There's strain, there's heat throughout the engine that may not exist to the same levels that you'd find in that old workhorse truck. And as a result, that oil is strained, stressed, and oil is critically important to keeping that engine running long time. If you do plan to keep a car like this for at least 10 years, keep doing those oil changes much more frequently than even the manufacturer recommends. Use the proper grade of oil, and of course, check it frequently. You never want to run low. You run low oil level on that just once is all it takes to actually create some sort of rod bearing issue, and you could literally run a bearing dry and cause irreversible damage. And with all of that said, be sure to check out that video. You're going to love that. That's all about the Mercedes-Benz versus Toyota controversy and which one will actually last longer these days. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye. That a lot of car owners are critical mistake that's many car either way, the first critical mistake that a lot of car owners are oh my